when billionaire CEO Charles Whitmore woke to silence in his glass mansion. He didn't think much of it, until he realized the woman who'd kept his world spotless had vanished. He was a man who lived in glass. Glass towers, glass cars, glass rules. Everything about Charles Whitmore reflected perfection back at him. And that morning, when he woke to the faint scent of lemon polish drifting through his penthouse, perfection was all he expected to see. The marble floors gleamed like mirrors. The chrome counters sparkled under the first wash of dawn. His reflection stared back, precise, composed, predictable. The city below was already awake, humming to the tune of his empire. But something in that symphony was missing. The silence. For 7 years, the faint sound of a woman's humming, low, soulful, like a memory of church mornings long past, had filled the edges of his mornings. Maya Brooks. She never sang loud enough to interrupt, only enough to exist. A presence you could feel but never quite name. Today, there was nothing. Charles checked his Rolex. 6 a.m. sharp. Coffee time. Normally, a cup would already be waiting beside the newspaper on his dining table. 2 sugars, no cream, steam curling just the way he liked. But the mug was cold and empty. He frowned, annoyed. Unacceptable. By 6:02, irritation had replaced confusion. He called out, "Maya." No answer. He tried again, louder, but the sound bounced back from the glass walls, swallowed by the stillness. When he reached his study, the first thing he noticed was the order. Everything spotless. Not a speck of dust, not a misaligned paper. It looked as though she had just finished cleaning, and then vanished into air. Then his gaze landed on the desk. Her uniform, the crisp gray one with the Argenti's logo, was folded with surgical precision. On top of it sat her staff ID and a ring of keys. One of them, he recognized, was for her private quarters in the service wing. The others were labeled neatly, except one, a small brass key with a strip of masking tape across it, handwritten in fine cursive, "Private." Charles stared at it for a long time, his jaw tightening. He picked up the phone. "Anna, it's Charles. Send someone from HR to replace the housemaid. The old one's quit." A pause crackled through the line. "Mr. Whitmore, she didn't quit, sir. She just left. No notice. We tried to call, but then she quit," he cut in, voice like glass under pressure. "Find a replacement by tomorrow." "Yes, sir." He hung up. For a man who ran a multinational tech empire, a missing maid was beneath his attention. People came and went, assistants, executives, wives. The only constant was his control. And yet, as he stood in the quiet of his penthouse, that control suddenly felt thin, like glass ready to crack. He poured himself coffee, ignoring the slight tremor in his hand. It was absurd. She was staff. She had no right to disturb his rhythm. And yet, for 7 years, her presence had been part of that rhythm. Reliable. Invisible. Essential. Charles walked the length of the hall that led to the service wing. Each step echoed too loudly against marble. The air grew cooler as he neared the end, where her room waited behind a plain white door. He stopped, staring. He had passed this door countless times, never once thinking to open it. Maya had kept it locked, always. He'd assumed it was where she slept between shifts, nothing more. But now, in the sterile hush, it seemed to watch him. He tried the handle. Locked. Of course. The brass key in his pocket suddenly felt heavier. Charles turned away. "Ridiculous," he muttered, retreating to his study. But as he sat down at his desk, his eyes drifted again toward that hallway. He told himself it didn't matter, that he had meetings, press briefings, numbers to chase. Still, he couldn't shake the thought. She left everything. Her clothes. Her pay. Her uniform. Her silence. People didn't leave that cleanly unless they wanted to be found, or forgotten. He opened his laptop and tried to focus on stock projections. But behind the columns of rising profits, his mind replayed the same question: why? He'd always thought of her as quiet, dutiful, plain. The kind of woman the world passes over without ever knowing her name. He couldn't remember a single personal thing she'd said about herself. No family, no friends. Just that hum, faint and warm, like something human that didn't belong in his mechanical life. Now it was gone. Charles rose again, restless. He found himself standing before the white door once more, the key cold between his fingers. The label stared up at him, private. He hesitated. He was not the kind of man who hesitated. He turned the key halfway, then stopped. No. Not now. Not yet. He pocketed the keys and exhaled slowly, as though they could steady the gnawing unease in his chest. The city outside was waking in gold and noise, but here inside, the world felt hollow. He looked once more at the folded uniform on his desk, the staff ID, the silence that lingered like perfume after someone has gone. Everyone has secrets, he whispered to himself. Even maids. But deep down, for the first time in years, Charles Whitmore felt something he couldn't quantify or suppress. Fear. And he had no idea yet that the truth behind that locked door would destroy everything he'd ever built. For the first time in years, Charles Whitmore couldn't sleep. The penthouse, usually a sanctuary of silence, seemed to echo back at him, every tick of the clock, every whisper of wind against glass. He sat in his study long after midnight, the folded uniform still lying where she'd left it. Her name glinted faintly on the ID badge, Maya Brooks. He'd said that name hundreds of times over the years, short, clipped, functional. Maya, the car. Maya, the floors. Maya, that will be all. But now, as he stared at it, it sounded unfamiliar. Like the name of a stranger who'd lived in his home for 7 years. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. Who was she, really? He remembered the day she arrived. It had been raining, not the kind of gentle drizzle that soothes, but the kind that slices the sky open. His former housekeeper, Mrs. Duval, had brought her to the door with quiet confidence. She's steady, Duval had said. Doesn't talk much, but you won't find better. Charles had barely looked up from his laptop. Fine. Background check. All clear. Then she starts Monday. When she'd stepped forward, he recalled, she'd said nothing. Just nodded, her eyes lowered, calm, unreadable. 4 years afterward, she remained exactly that, unreadable. She moved like she was part of the furniture, there when you needed her, gone when you didn't. Never late, never idle. If Charles left papers in chaos, they'd be stacked by morning. If he came home from a 14-hour meeting, his favorite scotch would be waiting on a napkin by the fireplace. He hadn't realized how much she'd noticed. A memory flickered, the winter of his divorce. The house had been in disarray, reporters swarming, lawyers circling like sharks. He'd come home one night to find the framed family portrait on his desk turned face down, covered by a folded white cloth. He hadn't asked who'd done it. He just assumed Maya had. He'd felt a faint, irrational relief. Then there was the time he'd fallen ill during a merger trip. No calls, no visitors. Only a cup of steaming ginger tea waiting by his bed, a note beside it in tidy handwriting. Drink this. Don't go to work today. He hadn't listened, but he remembered the warmth. He remembered thinking, absurdly, she pays attention. Now, as he stared into the city lights, he realized he knew nothing about her. Not where she lived, not her age, not if she had family. She'd never mentioned friends, never brought anyone by. Her life existed entirely within his walls, and now that she was gone, he was discovering how invisible she'd truly been. He opened his phone and dialed HR. Human Resources, Argentis Global, a polished voice answered. This is Charles Whitmore. I need you to locate a former employee, Maya Brooks. Domestic staff, personal division. Yes, Mr. Whitmore. One moment. Keys clacked faintly in the background. She submitted her resignation at 3:07 a.m. this morning. That's impossible, he snapped. She left last night. Yes, sir, it was by email. 2 lines only. Read it, he ordered. The voice hesitated. Sir, it says, I'm done cleaning what doesn't wash away. There's no signature. Just that. The line went silent. Charles sat motionless, the words sinking like stones. Cleaning what doesn't wash away. He dismissed the HR manager, then leaned forward, elbows on the desk. What was that supposed to mean? Guilt? Bitterness? Or something else? He opened his inbox. Nothing. Checked the security logs. She'd left at 11:42 p.m. sharp, camera footage showing her exiting through the service door with one small bag. Her gait was steady, unhurried, as though she'd planned this. He played the clip again, slower. She paused at the gate for half a second and looked back toward the mansion. Toward him. He couldn't see her expression, but somehow, it unsettled him more than if she'd glared. All day, he tried to bury himself in work. Numbers, reports, projections. But the silence behind the figures pressed at him. Every time he looked up from his laptop, he saw that ring of keys glinting from across the room. That night, near midnight, he gave up pretending. He wandered through the penthouse, past the immaculate dining hall, past the empty guest rooms, into the narrower hallway that led to the service wing. The lights dimmed as he approached the last door on the left. Maya's door. He stood there, staring at it, heartbeat audible in the stillness. He thought of that message again. I'm done cleaning what doesn't wash away. Was it resentment? Confession? Warning? He reached for the handle. His hand hovered, but didn't turn. Not yet. Somewhere deep down, beneath the habits of logic and control, something else stirred. The sense that whatever lay beyond that door wasn't meant to be opened by him. Not yet. He stepped back. Turned off the hallway light. But as he walked away, the scent of lemon polish still hung faintly in the air, mingled now with something darker, the weight of questions he could no longer ignore. And for the first time in his life, Charles Whitmore couldn't shake the feeling that the person who'd spent years cleaning his world might have been the only one who'd truly seen the dirt. By morning, the city had already begun to hum again. Glass towers glittering in the cold light, stock tickers pulsing like artificial heartbeats. But inside Charles Whitmore's penthouse, time had stopped. He'd spent the night pacing between his desk and the hallway, his reflection flickering in the dark glass walls. Every hour he told himself he'd stop thinking about it, and every hour, his eyes drifted again toward the white door at the end of the corridor. By sunrise, curiosity won. He stood before the door, the master key heavy in his hand. The label still read private. The word looked almost alive now, as though it had been waiting for him. He turned the key. The lock gave with a soft click. The door swung open. At first, he thought he'd made a mistake. It didn't look like a maid's quarters. It looked like something sacred. The air was still, scented faintly with lavender and old paper. No bed, no vanity, no clutter. Just a single desk, a corkboard, and walls lined from floor to ceiling with photographs. Charles stepped inside, slowly. The photos were of children, smiling, fragile, brave. Some were in wheelchairs, others hooked to oxygen tubes. Their faces were taped beside hospital letters, thank you cards, and donation receipts. He traced a name that appeared over and over. The Brooks Foundation. He blinked. He'd heard of it vaguely. A small nonprofit that sent aid to pediatric cancer wards and environmental clinics. He'd even signed off on a small tax write-off donation years ago, not realizing who ran it. He stepped closer. The handwriting on the thank you notes was childish but full of warmth. Thank you, Miss Brooks. Eli would be proud. You helped us when no one else would. His gaze moved toward the corkboard. There, pinned in a precise grid, were newspaper clippings. He froze. The headlines were all too familiar. Argenti's chemical plant denies responsibility for water contamination. CEO Charles Whitmore declines common families file class action lawsuit over birth defects. He felt the blood drain from his face. That disaster, 15 years ago, had been one of Argenti's first major acquisitions. The plant had leaked toxic runoff into a river in a small Ohio town. Dozens had fallen ill. Several children were born with deformities. The lawsuits had come fast and furious, and he'd done what CEOs did best, buried them. He remembered the meeting like a snapshot. A table full of lawyers. His legal counsel's voice, "We can settle quietly, Mr. Whitmore. A few million in hush money and non-disclosures, no admission of guilt." And he'd signed. Without reading the testimonies. Without looking at the names. Until now. Charles's hand trembled as he reached for the desk. A single manila folder waited there. Across the front, written in block letters, Whitmore v. Brooks. He opened it. Inside were photographs, small-town houses with boarded windows, medical records, chemical analyses stamped confidential. And then, a birth certificate. He read it once. Then again. Mother, Maya Brooks. Father, blank, child, Eli Brooks. Deceased, age 7. He stared at the attached photograph, a young boy, maybe 6 or 7, grinning beneath a hospital blanket. A gap-toothed smile. A small dimple on the left cheek. And eyes, sharp, cold, unmistakable. Ice blue. The same color he saw in the mirror every morning. For a moment, the room tilted. He gripped the edge of the desk, struggling to breathe. His mind raced backward, years of details colliding like falling glass. Maya's quiet glances. Her silence whenever reporters mentioned his company. The way she always left the TV off when corporate news came on. She had worked for him all this time, 7 years, while he'd been the face of the company that took her child. And she'd said nothing. Charles sank into the chair, his throat tightening. The paper shook in his hands. He found more documents in the folder, medical notes, testimonies from families, even a draft of a legal complaint, written but never filed. Each page was a wound. Each signature had a name he'd erased with money. He read the last page, a handwritten letter, dated 3 years ago. If truth won't come from the powerful, it will come from those who clean their floors. I can't hate him anymore. But I won't stop until the children's names are seen. The signature at the bottom, Maya B. Charles closed the folder slowly. The silence in the room pressed around him, thick as grief. The photograph stared down, hundreds of tiny faces frozen in joy, suffering, and innocence. He felt them watching, judging. His empire had been built on silence, and now, silence was all that remained. He walked to the corkboard again, tracing one headline with his fingertip, CEO Charles Whitmore declines comment. That same headline had once been a shield. Now it felt like a confession. He sank into the chair and let out a long, shuddering breath. Somewhere in the distance, the city buzzed, life, wealth, movement, but it all sounded hollow. On the desk, the folder remained open, the boy's photograph staring up at him. Charles reached out, his hand trembling, and touched the image, the eyes so familiar they burned. Eli, he whispered. The name cracked on his tongue. For the first time in his life, the man who had built a billion-dollar empire couldn't find a single word that mattered. Only the silence did. And in that silence, something inside him finally broke. The file from Maya's desk lay open across his lap as the helicopter descended through gray morning clouds. Argenta Falls. A name he hadn't said aloud in 15 years. Once, it had been a small industrial town that Argenti's Chemical had promised to revitalize. A place of proud factory workers and bright playgrounds, before the water turned sour. Charles had signed the closure papers himself. He remembered the language, environmental restructuring. That was what they'd called it, neat, bloodless words for something that had killed a town. The rotor blades slowed. The pilot's voice broke the silence. "We're here, sir." Charles stepped onto cracked asphalt. The wind smelled faintly of rust and rain. The factory stood at the edge of the valley like a corpse of steel and concrete, windows shattered, pipes twisted like ribs. The sign still hung crooked over the gate, Argenti's Chemical Plant, a division of Argenti's Global Technologies. He stared at it for a long time. 15 years ago, this had been his victory. His first major acquisition. The deal that made investors take him seriously. He remembered the press conference, the cameras, the headline, Whitmore expands operations into energy sector. He'd worn his best suit that day. Smiled. Promised jobs. Promised safety. And when the reports came, when mothers called crying, when lawsuits followed, he buried it all under paperwork and legal silence. Routine liability, his lawyers had called it. Just pay them off. He had. without reading a single testimony. Now, the ghost town stared back. He walked through the empty streets alone. Abandoned homes slumped beside the cracked road. Playgrounds rusted, swings creaking in the cold wind. A single plastic tricycle lay overturned in the grass, sun-bleached and broken. Charles tried to imagine laughter here. The kind that used to echo through these yards before the water turned to poison. His shoes crunched over gravel. The silence felt heavier with every step. He stopped in front of what used to be a church, small white, its bell tower leaning to one side. A sign by the door reads St. Augustine Parish, all are welcome. The paint had peeled, but the door was open. Inside, candles burned weakly on the altar. A man in a threadbare collar was sweeping the aisle. He looked up as Charles entered. "Can I help you, son?" the priest asked, voice quiet but wary. Charles hesitated. He hadn't called anyone father in decades. "I'm looking for someone," he said. "Maya Brooks." At the name, the priest's expression softened. "Miss Brooks," he said, as though recalling a memory that warmed the cold. "She used to come every year. Brought food, medicine, books for the children. Paid tuition for a few of them, too. Every year. Rain or shine," the priest nodded. "Even when she looked like she hadn't slept in days. Said this place was her promise." Charles swallowed. "Do you know why?" The priest set the broom aside. "She lost her son here. One of the first. She never blamed anyone, at least not out loud. But she never stopped coming." He gestured toward the back pew. That was her spot. Sat there for hours. Never asked for prayer. Just sat in silence. Charles turned to look. The last pew on the left was worn smooth, the cushion flattened. A faint indentation remained, the shape of someone who'd spent years waiting for forgiveness. He felt a pressure in his chest he couldn't name. "How did she afford all that?" he asked quietly. The priest smiled faintly. "She said kindness was just redistribution. Taking from one corner of the world to fill another. I never knew what she meant, but she always had enough to give." Charles knew. He saw it clearly now, the way she'd saved every paycheck, every bonus he'd given without thought. The foundation, the scholarships, the care packages. She'd taken his money, the same money born from the plant that had killed her son, and used it to rebuild what he destroyed. It wasn't charity. It was reclamation. A lifetime of cleaning, turned into redemption. When he left the church, rain had begun to fall, slow and cold, soaking through his coat. He drove through the outskirts of the town. A faded sign read "Welcome to Argenta Falls, where industry meets community." Below it, someone had scrawled in red paint, "And both died." He stopped the car and stared until the words blurred in the rain. The guilt was no longer abstract, no longer just ink on paper or headlines in the past. It had a smell, a sound, a weight. He parked by a small bridge that crossed the river, the same river that had carried the waste downstream. The water still ran blackish, the current sluggish. He stood there for a long time, the rain drumming on the hood of his car. Once, this river had powered the plant that made him rich. Now, it carried ghosts. He thought of Maya walking these same streets, year after year, carrying boxes of supplies and envelopes of cash. Quiet, unnoticed. Cleaning what couldn't be cleaned. Her resignation echoed in his mind again. "I'm done cleaning what doesn't wash away." He looked at the water, at his reflection rippling in its surface, fractured, uncertain, almost unrecognizable. For the first time in his life, Charles Whitmore didn't see a CEO staring back. He saw the man behind the stain. The rain from Argenta Falls followed him home, or at least that's how it felt. When Charles Whitmore's car pulled into the marble driveway of his mansion, the sky still hung low and gray. He hadn't slept in 2 days. The memory of those children's photographs had burned itself into the back of his eyelids. He wanted silence again, the sterile calm of numbers and schedules. But even silence had turned against him. As he stepped out, the first thing he saw were the black SUVs. Unmarked, idling quietly at the edge of the property. Men in dark suits waited by the entrance, the kind that didn't wait long. One stepped forward and held up a badge. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm Special Agent Turner, Federal Financial Crimes Division. We have warrants to search your premises." Charles blinked, his voice low but sharp. "For what reason?" "An anonymous submission, sir. Documents linking your offshore accounts to undisclosed settlement funds. Multiple violations under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act." The words landed like stones. Behind the agent, more men were already filing into the house, through his doors, down his hallways, into his office. Clipboards, cameras, scanners. One of them began photographing the very desk where Maya's uniform had once lain. He tried to steady himself. "There must be some mistake," he said. "I'll have my attorneys." The agent's tone didn't change. "Your attorneys have been contacted. You'll want to call your board, too." He didn't answer. By the time he reached Argenti's tower, the news had already broken. Headlines screamed across every monitor. "Argenti's under federal investigation. CEO linked to offshore bribery and cover-up files." Inside the boardroom, the air was thick with panic. Executives avoided his eyes. Phones buzzed. Lawyers whispered. "Charles," said one of the board members, his tone brittle with fear, "what the hell is this? Auditors just froze our accounts. The market's tanking." Charles dropped his briefcase on the table. "It's nothing we can't contain. Someone's fishing." "Fishing?" Another snapped. "They have signed memos, Whitmore. Signed in your name." He froze. "That's impossible." "Then explain this," the man said, shoving a printed document across the table. It was a scanned memo dated 9 years ago, authorizing a confidential payout to plaintiffs of the Argenta case. His signature gleamed at the bottom. He didn't remember signing it. Or maybe he did, one of hundreds shoved across his desk, rubber-stamped by legal. His hand had signed it, but his conscience hadn't looked. Another executive spoke up, voice shaking. "Whoever leaked this had access to internal archives, encrypted ledgers, private transfers. It's not an outsider." The words hung in the air like smoke. Not an outsider. Charles felt his stomach tighten. He already knew who it was, though he didn't want to admit it. That night, the mansion felt colder than ever. The search teams had gone, leaving everything in precise disarray, drawers half open, files sealed in evidence bags. The scent of lemon polish still lingered faintly in the hall, but it no longer felt clean. On his desk, a single box waited. No markings. No return address. He hesitated before opening it. Inside was a small USB drive and a folded sheet of paper. He unfolded it slowly. "You built an empire on silence. I'm done being part of it, Tim." His breath caught. He turned on his computer and inserted the drive. The screen flickered to life. Folders, dozens of them. Internal memos. Scanned invoices. Payoff ledgers. Private communications between executives. And there, in his own voice, were the things he'd spent years pretending didn't exist. Audio recordings of meetings. Emails approving settlements. Legal drafts detailing the cover-ups. Every secret he'd buried under the weight of wealth and arrogance. Preserved, catalogued, time-stamped. He clicked one folder labeled Argenta_files. The first image was a scanned newspaper clipping of himself standing at the factory ribbon-cutting ceremony, smiling beside the mayor, holding a silver shovel. Under it, Maya had written in neat handwriting, "Everything begins with a man who won't look down." He closed his eyes. She had seen everything, from the marble floors she polished to the headlines he ignored. She had lived in his shadow for 7 years, watching, collecting, building the truth piece by piece while pretending to serve. Maya Brooks, the maid he'd never noticed, had outmaneuvered the empire he thought was untouchable. It wasn't theft. It wasn't revenge. It was revelation. She hadn't stolen his fortune, she'd stolen his silence. By midnight, his phone was ringing non-stop, the board, the lawyers, the press. He didn't answer. He just sat there in the dark, staring at the flickering screen filled with his sins. He tried to feel anger. He tried to summon the old pride that had built his empire. But all he felt was an ache, deep, human, unfamiliar. He reached for the note again, tracing her words with his thumb. You built an empire on silence. Outside, the city shimmered, towers of light and glass that reflected his name on every corner. For years, that reflection had been enough. But now, all he saw in it was the faint silhouette of a woman with a mop and a secret. And for the first time in his life, Charles Whitmore wished he could take back the clean. By dawn, his face was everywhere. The world had turned its cameras toward the fall of Charles Whitmore, visionary CEO, architect of modern wealth, industry titan. Now the headlines wrote him a new title. Maid of Billionaire CEO exposes environmental scandal, Ginny stocks in freefall as new evidence surfaces, Charles Whitmore silent as investors flee. The media loved the contrast, the billionaire and the maid. Power and humility. The man who had everything, and the woman no one ever saw. Every network ran the same story, a quiet housekeeper turned whistleblower, unmasking the empire of deceit from inside its marble walls. They replayed her resignation line on talk shows, turned it into memes, hashtags, late-night punchlines. I'm done cleaning what doesn't wash away. It was poetry now. By mid-morning, Argenti's Global's value had fallen 40%. Shareholders were calling for resignations. Lobbyists distanced themselves. Politicians who'd once praised Whitmore's philanthropy now condemned his negligence. Reporters camped outside his mansion gates, cameras flashing every time the curtains moved. He hadn't left the house since the agents came. He couldn't. Inside, the silence had become a kind of mirror, one that showed him what he'd ignored all his life. The sound of wealth collapsing was quieter than he expected. It wasn't thunder. It was a clock ticking, a phone unanswered, a company bleeding value in real time. For decades, he believed success was permanence. That the skyscrapers and press conferences and glowing screens would outlive him. But empires didn't crumble with earthquakes. They eroded, grain by grain, truth by truth. And Maya Brooks had been the rain. That afternoon, his lawyer called. You've been subpoenaed, she said. Federal hearing next week. They'll want you to testify under oath. Charles stared at the wall. Will they arrest me? Not yet, she replied carefully. But if you're found complicit in the falsified documents. He hung up before she finished. Night came early, the sky over the city bruised with storm clouds. He poured a drink but didn't touch it. The glass felt heavy, pointless. He wandered through the penthouse halls, every reflection of himself feeling smaller than the last. Then his steps slowed before the narrow hallway, the one that led to Maya's old room. The door stood slightly ajar now. The agents had searched it days ago, but the scent of lavender still lingered. He entered quietly, as if stepping into someone's memory. The room hadn't changed since the morning he'd first opened it, except now, it didn't feel like accusation. It felt like presence. He walked slowly, tracing the edges of the photographs again, the children's faces, the hospital letters, the certificates. But this time, he noticed things he'd missed before. The corners of the notes were worn, read often, treasured. The handwriting in the letters overflowed with gratitude. Miss Brooks, thank you for the scholarship. Eli's name will live through your kindness. You gave us clean water when no one else cared. On a shelf sat a stack of binders labeled Eli Fund Reports, Clean Water Programs, Environmental Cleanups, Medical Grants. Each file detailed the quiet work Maya had done for years, all funded through anonymous donations. His donations. Money he'd given without thought, bonuses, raises, Christmas envelopes. She had turned his arrogance into mercy. Charles sank into the same chair where he'd once found the folder. His hands brushed the edge of the desk, and he whispered into the still air. You didn't destroy me, Maya. The words felt strange at first, then inevitable. You cleaned me. He looked up at the photographs again, hundreds of faces, living proof that the woman he'd overlooked had done more good with scraps than he had with millions. He saw now what she'd truly built, not revenge, but restoration. Not exposure for profit, but justice without cruelty. Every headline calling her a whistleblower missed the truth. She wasn't a destroyer. She was a purifier. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the room for a single breath. For a moment, he imagined Maya there, standing in the doorway with that faint half-smile she used to wear when he ignored her good sense. He spoke softly, almost afraid of breaking the quiet. "You could have taken everything," he said. "But you only took the truth." He stood, looking once more at the corkboard of newspaper clippings. One caught his eye, a small handwritten note pinned between two articles. "Cleaning isn't erasing. It's revealing what's underneath." He exhaled slowly. That was what she had done, revealed what was underneath. The empire. The scandal. Himself. Outside, thunder rolled over the city. In the distance, he could see Argenti's tower glowing faintly through the rain, his creation, his monument, his confession in steel and glass. Tomorrow, he would walk into that building one last time. Not as its ruler, but as the man ready to face it. He didn't know what would happen next: indictment, exile, disgrace. It didn't matter. Because somewhere between the silence and the headlines, a maid had shown him what it really meant to clean. The world called it the trial of the decade. By the time Charles Whitmore walked into the courthouse, the steps outside were a forest of cameras. Reporters shouted his name, microphones thrust forward like weapons. Helicopters circled overhead. Banners scrolled across every screen in the city. Argenti's CEO to testify under oath. Billionaire faces federal inquiry in whistleblower case. He moved through the flashing lights in silence, flanked by lawyers who whispered instructions he barely heard. Inside, the air buzzed with heat and judgment. Rows of journalists. Victims' families. Former employees. Every seat filled. Every gaze sharpened. He took his place at the front. The federal seal glared down from the wall, justice, blindfolded and cold. "Mr. Whitmore," the prosecutor began, "you are aware you're under oath?" He nodded. "We'll start with these." The prosecutor lifted a thick folder, the same evidence Maya had gathered. These documents confirm the falsification of environmental reports, the concealment of settlements, and direct authorization for corporate payoffs. Your signature appears here, here, and here. Do you deny these signatures? His lawyers leaned in. "Say they were handled by your legal team," one whispered. "Say you were unaware." For a moment, he almost did. The instinct for self-preservation was still there, the old reflex of survival wrapped in confidence. But then he looked up, and saw a row of photographs displayed on the courtroom projector. Children. The same ones from Maya's wall. Their names flickered across the screen, Eli Brooks among them. The words that had always come so easily to him, denial, deflection, justification, turned to ash on his tongue. He cleared his throat. "No," he said softly. "I don't deny them." A ripple went through the room. The prosecutor frowned. "Excuse me." Charles straightened, his voice steady now, stripped of every shield. "Those are my signatures. My memos. My choices. I signed off on deaths I never saw. I traded lives for profit margins. I let my company bury what it broke, and I let myself believe that meant I wasn't responsible." Gasps cut through the air. Cameras clicked in rapid bursts. His lawyers froze. He continued. "For years, I thought control was power. That if I kept everything spotless, nothing could touch me. But one woman, a maid, made me look in the mirror. And I didn't recognize the man staring back." The judge called for order, but the courtroom had already erupted. Whispers, flashes, disbelief. The man once untouchable, confessing on record. He didn't stop. "I used to believe silence protected me. That wealth meant freedom. But silence isn't clean. It's rot. She showed me that." His lawyer tugged at his sleeve. "Charles." He raised a hand. "No. Let me finish." He turned back to the room. "I can't undo what I did. But I can stop pretending I didn't know. The documents are real. The damage is real. And so was the woman who made me see it." For the first time since the scandal began, the cameras stopped feeling like weapons. They felt like witnesses. When it was over, The board resigned within hours. Argenti's global stock hit historic lows. Investors pulled out. His name was stripped from every building, every award, every plaque that once celebrated him. By evening, the courthouse steps were a storm of flashing lights again. Reporters shouted questions as he emerged. "Mr. Whitmore, do you have anything to say to your shareholders? Was the maid acting alone? Are you cooperating with investigators?" Charles paused at the podium, the wind tugging at his coat. He looked out at the sea of cameras, at the microphones that once would have amplified his power. He took a breath. "A maid," he said quietly, "taught me what it means to clean." The crowd went silent. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The sentence hung there, simple and absolute, cutting through the noise. Far behind the barricades, unnoticed by most, a woman stood in the rain. Hood drawn low, her face half-shadowed. Maya Brooks. Her eyes followed him as he stepped down from the podium. For years she had carried the weight of his silence. Now she watched him carry his own. Reporters shouted. Sirens wailed. But in that single instant, there was only the two of them, the man who'd built an empire on lies, and the woman who'd taught him the truth. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away quickly, turning before anyone could see. Charles glanced into the crowd once, sensing her there, though he couldn't prove it. A faint shape in the storm. A ghost, maybe. Or a guardian. He didn't call out. He just lowered his head as the rain began to fall harder. Because for the first time, the rain didn't feel like ruin. It felt like cleansing. It didn't happen with sirens or handcuffs. When Charles Whitmore fell, it happened quietly, one signature at a time. He resigned from Argenti's Global 3 days after his confession. The board accepted it in a single line of text. No farewell speech. No ceremony. Just a press release stamped effective immediately. The empire he'd built for 30 years unraveled overnight. He sold his holdings, emptied his accounts, and liquidated the mansions, cars, art, everything that had defined him. Each sale felt like an unbuilding, a slow dismantling of the life that had shielded him from consequence. Half of it went to government restitution funds. The rest, he directed personally, to the families of Argenta Falls. No cameras. No press. Just quiet transfers and signed letters of apology. When the last check cleared, he vanished from public life. For months, no one knew where he went. He lived out of a modest apartment near the riverfront. No staff, no assistants, no noise. He cooked for himself, badly. He learned to sweep floors. He walked the streets alone, sometimes unrecognized, sometimes not. When strangers whispered his name, he didn't correct them. He spent long nights staring at the city skyline, thinking about Maya's words. Some stains don't wash out. She'd been right. He would never be clean again, not in the way he once understood it. But maybe, if he was lucky, he could still learn to live in the light. Winter thawed into spring when he heard about it, a news snippet buried in the local section of a Detroit paper. New children's clinic opens in Detroit, founded by the Brooks Foundation. He read the name twice, his pulse quickening. The article showed a photograph, a small red brick building with white columns and bright murals painted by local artists. Above the entrance, in clean metal letters, the name. The Eli Brooks Center for Environmental Justice. He sat staring at the image for a long time before quietly folding the paper. The next morning, he drove north. The center was smaller than he imagined, not the grand institution his money once built, but something better. Children played in the courtyard, their laughter bright against the hum of city traffic. Inside, the air smelled of crayons and disinfectant, and walls were lined with art, rainbows, rivers, handprints in paint. A bulletin board listed weekly programs, community health drives, water filtration projects, environmental youth initiative. A receptionist looked up from her desk. "Can I help you, sir?" "I'm visiting," he said, his voice low. "An old friend." She smiled and pointed toward the playroom. He found her there. Maya sat in a circle of children, reading aloud from a worn storybook. Her voice was soft, measured, the same calm rhythm he remembered from her humming in the hallways of his mansion. The children leaned against her, listening, smiling. She didn't see him at first. He stood at the doorway, watching, not wanting to intrude on something pure. When she finally looked up, their eyes met. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she rose, gently closing the book, and approached him. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, her tone polite, unreadable. "I never thanked you," he said quietly. She tilted her head. "For what?" "For the truth." A faint smile touched her lips. Not kind, not cruel, just real. "Some stains don't wash out, Mr. Whitmore," she said softly. "You just learn to see them in the light." He nodded, his throat tightening. "You did more than clean up my house," he said. "You cleaned up my soul." Maya's gaze lowered. "I didn't clean it," she replied. "You did, the moment you stopped hiding from the dirt." The words hit him harder than any courtroom verdict. Before he left, he placed a small envelope on her desk. No logo, no name, just a handwritten line on the front. "For Eli. For every child I failed." She didn't open it. She didn't need to. She simply pressed her hand over it and nodded once, eyes glistening. As he walked out, the afternoon sun poured through the glass doors, spilling across the floor like gold. The laughter of children followed him into the street, light, unbroken, forgiving. He looked back one last time. Through the window, he could see her kneeling beside a little boy, tying his shoelace, smiling faintly as she spoke to him. It was the kind of smile he'd never earned before, gentle, undeserved, but freely given. For the first time in his life, Charles Whitmore didn't feel like a man who'd lost everything. He felt like a man finally beginning again. 6 months had passed since the world stopped saying his name. Charles Whitmore no longer appeared on magazine covers or stock tickers. The headlines had moved on: new scandals, new billionaires, new noise. He lived now in a narrow townhouse on the outskirts of Boston, a building so old the walls leaned slightly, as if tired of standing. He didn't mind. He liked things that showed their cracks. Each morning, he rose before dawn, not to chase profit margins, but to walk by the river. The mist over the water reminded him of the steam that once rose from the cooling towers at Argenta Falls, but here, it smelled clean. The air didn't sting anymore. He worked for a small environmental nonprofit, Clean Earth Initiative. His title, advisor, volunteer position. He didn't earn much, but for the first time in decades, every dollar he spent came without guilt. He helped lobby for stricter pollution laws, drafted sustainability reports for small towns, taught young executives about corporate ethics, the irony of which never escaped him. Sometimes people recognized him, the fallen tycoon who confessed on live television. They expected arrogance or shame. Instead, they found a quiet man with calloused hands and tired eyes, who never turned away when someone mentioned Maya Brooks. That evening, he returned home to the one room he still couldn't stop visiting, her room. He'd kept it exactly as she'd left it. Not as evidence. Not as penance. As remembrance. The walls were no longer papered with chaos. He'd restored the photographs, framed each one carefully, cleaned the edges, labeled every child's name in delicate brass plates beneath. Eli Brooks. Naomi Jansen. Liam Okoro. Faith Morales. 52 names in total. Children who had lived, suffered, or died because of what his company's negligence had unleashed. Their laughter, frozen in those images, haunted him less now, not because he'd forgotten, but because he'd finally learned to listen to what they were saying. He sat at Maya's old desk, running his fingers along the wood. It still carried faint traces of polish, her scent of lemon and soap. The folder lay open before him, Whitmore v. Brooks. It had started as her weapon, and become his salvation. Inside were the documents that had once damned him, reports, photos, ledgers, but at the very back, he had added something new, a folded page. It was his public apology. The one he'd written not for the court, but for the people. "I cannot undo what I built, nor return the lives my decisions took. But I can spend what remains of mine ensuring no one profits from another's suffering again. This is my atonement, not an end, but a beginning." He slipped it carefully into the folder, aligning the edges. Then he closed it for the last time. On the wall opposite the desk hung a single photograph, enlarged, centered, commanding the room. A young boy, 7, maybe 8, smiling despite the oxygen tubes that curled across his cheeks. His eyes were a sharp, ice blue, startlingly familiar. Eli Brooks. Charles stood before the image for a long time. He remembered the night he found that picture, how it had hollowed him out, stripped him of every illusion of control. Now it filled him with something else entirely, peace. He reached up, straightening the frame, and murmured softly, "You built your first fortune from silence, Charles. Your second," he paused, voice catching, "from redemption." The room was quiet. Outside, the city lights shimmered faintly through the tall glass window. The skyline glowed, a reflection not of power, but of penance. He stepped closer to the window, the night pressing softly against the glass. In the reflection, he saw both worlds layered over each other, the city's high towers behind him, Maya's memorial before him. Once, that view would have made him feel untouchable. Now, it made him feel human. He stood there until the horizon paled with dawn. The first light touched the photographs, glinting off the brass nameplates like tiny halos. For the first time in his life, Charles Whitmore felt clean, not spotless, not forgiven but honest. He whispered to the still air, "You were right, Maya. Some stains don't wash out." He smiled faintly. "But they can teach us where the light comes from." The wind outside lifted, brushing through the half-open window, carrying with it the distant sounds of children's laughter, faint, free, eternal. He closed his eyes and let it fill the room.
Thank you for watching this story. If this moved you, leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the videos on your screen to watch more powerful stories just like these.